Saludos, familia. ¿Saben lo que es mañana? Do you know what tomorrow is? It's election day in the United States, midterm elections to be exact. President Biden, who was campaigning in New York this weekend, framed these midterm elections by saying that democracy is on the ballot. And with, as per the Pew Research, roughly 35 million Latinos eligible to vote in the midterms this year, which accounts for approximately 14% of the electorate. Once again, all eyes are on the Latina community vote. And so today we are bringing you part 2 of our special voting edition of Tambora Dialogues and have invited Dr. Geraldo Cadava to talk with us about his book, The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump, and what it means for the misguided concept of the Latino vote, and to determine if there are currently any common priorities among the Latina community that could be a game changer for either Democrats or Republicans during the midterms. So Dr. Geraldo Cadava is a historian. He's author and a political analyst. He's professor of history and Latina and Latino studies at Northwestern University. And in addition to being the author of The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump, he is also the author of A Standing on Common Ground, The Making of a Sunbelt Borderland. So Geraldo, welcome to the Drum Circle.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Erasma. It's great to be here.
Wonderful, thank you. So Geraldo, the Tambora Dialogues team and I really find your work refreshing because it acknowledges our diversity as a community and also very insightful because it delves into the very nuanced but also really complicated dynamic between liberalism and conservatism in our community. And so can you share with our audience a bit about yourself and what motivated you to do this kind of work?
Oh, such a good question. So, I became interested in this book, writing The Hispanic Republican, for 2 main reasons. First, my grandfather is Hispanic Republican. He's born in Panama, but his mom is Colombiana and his father is Filipino, and they came together in Panama. And then he served in the U.S. Air Force for a long time, retired at Davis Monthan Air Force Base, married my grandmother, who's a Mexican-American woman, and voted for a Republican for the first time in 1980 when he voted for Ronald Reagan for the very specific reason that Reagan was promising to lower his taxes and put more money back into his biweekly paycheck. After he retired from the U.S. Air Force, he went and worked in a copper mine in Tucson, Arizona, near Tucson, Arizona, called Silver Bell. And that's when he voted for Reagan for the first time. And he and I spent much of my childhood and kind of early teenage years arguing about politics. I just wanted to, I felt like I kept butting up against a wall with him in a lot of ways because I just wanted to understand. He was my grandfather. He was the person I would go play baseball with and who, took me bowling. But he and I just kept butting heads about politics, and he would talk about border security and immigrating legally the right way. He would talk about abuses of the welfare system. He would talk about, this was in the early 90s, so when cable news was just getting going, and he would talk about how Bill O'Reilly really had his back and was looking out for him. And I didn't understand. So that was in the back of my mind all along. That just kind of shaped how I grew up and, my experience with my grandfather. Then I wrote my first book about Tucson, Arizona, and one of the main characters in that book was a conservative department store owner named Alex Jacome, who was good friends with Barry Goldwater. He hated Cesar Chavez, the founder of the United Farm Workers Union. He didn't think that any of the employees in his store needed unionization because he would take care of them like the patron at the head of a big operation. So he didn't think his employees needed union representation. And so he was the first kind of Latino conservative that I had come across in an archive who was not a Cuban exile. The Cuban exile community, they were like the typical example of Latino conservatives that I had studied and known about. So to come across this Mexican-American department store owner in the 1950s and 1960s in Tucson really gave me the sense that there must be this much wider world of Latino conservatism that we didn't know very much about. I kind of also sensed that to be true from all of my lifetime of arguments with my grandfather. So I wanted to dig deeper. I wanted to learn more about this story and to figure out exactly what was going on among Latino conservatives. And so that's why I started writing this book. I started by kind of uncovering a lot of really interesting political biographies of people like Romana Acosta Bañuelos, who was the first Hispanic treasurer of the United States as a Republican appointed by Richard Nixon, people like Ben Fernandez, who was the first Hispanic president for candidate as a Republican in 1980. And then I just uncovered that story more and more.
Wow. So there's obviously and your book talks about this, a very long history of Republican loyalty in our community. But before we delve into that, I want to ask you a couple of questions about Ronald Reagan. I mean, I remember, when I was growing up and Ronald Reagan ran for re-election in like 1984, and how actively he was trying to attract the Latina voters, right? And he was so steadfast in his belief that his anti-communist initiatives in Central America, his tough rhetoric on crime, his support for bilingual education and stronger enforcement of the Voting Rights Act and immigration policies and prairie schools, and all of those things were aligned with our community's values. And I mean, in reality, they are, right? And so hence came his famous quote, "Latinos are Republicans and they just don't know it yet."
Yeah.
But despite those values alignment, for example, and I'll talk about my family specifically, my family stuck with the Democratic Party, and they still do to this day. And over the years, like you've asked your grandparent, your grandfather, I asked them too, why? Like, why are you all like so, loyal to the Democratic ticket, regardless of who's the candidate?
Yeah.
And my family told me, well, we're Latinos, and all Latinos are born Democrats. And I was just like, okay, so that's not it. And so this message, this trope that Latinos are politically one way or another is something that I think has been peddled by both Republicans and Democrats for decades, right? So why is it so persistent?
Oh man, these are great questions, deep questions. It's so interesting to hear your family's story too, because I think Latinos did make different decisions, right? Like my grandfather made one to vote for the first time as a Republican because this particular Republican was promising to put more money back into his biweekly paychecks. Reagan was also the first Republican to really bring in Cuban Americans to the Republican Party through his relationship with Jorge Mascanosa and the Cuban American National Foundation, and to really articulate these kind of what he and his Hispanic campaign advisors argued were these core conservative beliefs among Latinos, like anti-communism, like a work ethic, like traditional family values, things like that. And so he was the first person to really articulate these things. So that is one way of going about that decision. But I think I've heard similar stories to the one that you told about your family too. I had a student here at Northwestern when I first taught a course on Latino politics tell me that her grandmother in northern New Jersey, who I believe was Dominicana or Puerto Rican, I can't remember, but she was saying that, it's so interesting. My grandma, all of her positions align with the position of the Republican Party, but as long as Republicans are racist, she's not going to vote for them. She just, there was something holding her back. And, I'm not sure what the tipping point is for Latinos. In my grandfather's case, it was taxes. In your family's case, it was this kind of bedrock idea that Latinos just don't vote Republican. So I think both of those stories are true and happen in our communities. I think that, there's a lot going on when you hear the idea that Latinos are natural Democrats. I still hear this all the time from progressive pollsters who just say Latinos are progressive. And whenever they say that, I just want to say progressive Latinos are progressive for sure. but Latinos are all over the map, So I think that on the one hand, the people we hear talk the most about who Latino voters are, the people who are explaining Latino voters to the audiences of MSNBC, primarily MSNBC, but also CNN, they are Democrats, and they're not forthcoming about their political affiliations. They talk as representatives of Voto Latino, or they talk as representatives of Naleo, or they talk as former campaign managers of the Bernie Sanders campaign, for example. And they are the Latino spokespeople who get out in front of cameras and explain to America who Latino voters are, but they don't tell them the crucial part of the information, that they are Democrats themselves.
Right.
And so there isn't a kind of, I don't think there really is a kind of even-handed media analysis of who Latinos are. And I think one of the problems with that is that most of the viewers, like of MSNBC or CNN or Fox, they don't care enough about Latinos to dig beneath what the person on screen is telling them. They're like, oh, Maria Teresa Kumar, she's a Latina. She must know what Latinas believe. So we're going to take her word for it. Or Chuck Rocha, he's a Latino. He must know what Latinos are all about. So we're going to take his word for it. And I think that's part of the problem too. There's also just the fact that the majority of Latinos are Democrats, so it's not that when Democrats say that a majority of Latinos are Democrats, they're not wrong about that, but there's been so much attention to the shift over the past few years because, it's never been the case that Democrats were happy with winning a simple majority of the Latino vote. They've always expected to rack up like 40 or 35 or 30 point margins. They've thought that the margin was going to be like 70-30 or 65-35 or even 60-40, and that was going to deliver victories for them. So now that it's getting closer to an even split, and we'll see what happens. There's been so many polls, so much posturing over the past couple of years, and it's even picking up in the last few days, that we don't know exactly what's going to happen. The most important thing is going to be to see who shows up and in what numbers tomorrow. That's the only thing that matters. But, I think now that we're getting closer and closer to seeing Latinos as a swing vote, that's a kind of new, uncomfortable reality for many longtime Democratic strategists who aren't familiar with that landscape, and they're having a hard time, in my opinion, adjusting to that new reality.
Right. I mean, and the reality is that we don't get enough attention in the off years, right?
No.
Like it's always like during that election year is all of a sudden like when both Republicans and Democrats are really, fired up and trying to get the Latino community to come out and really vote.
Yeah.
Can you speak to why that is?
Yeah, well, there's so much to say about this. These are really excellent questions. And, I think Democrats, for the most part, historically, have really been relying on a kind of get out the vote model of turning out Latino voters, which means that the key to, winning the Latino vote is, in presidential election years, shortly after the national conventions of both the Democratic and Republican parties, like in late August, just as Hispanic Heritage Month is about to begin, that's when you start sending out surrogates and candidates to start recruiting Latino voters. And I'm not saying this is a unique problem to Democrats. This has historically been a problem of the Republican Party as well. So I think you even saw it again this year, where for the most part, the Democratic Party really only started getting going. A lot of the campaigns really started making making inroads among Latinos in earnest in September. And for decades, Latinos have said that's just too late. So one of the things that Chuck Rocha always talks about is that, he started reaching out to, and Bernie Sanders, his boss in 2020, made it Latinos a priority from almost the day that he lost the primary to Hillary Clinton in 2016. So Chuck Rocha started getting out, developing relationships with Latinos in Nevada and everywhere else shortly after the 2016 election in preparation for 2020. And that's one of the reasons that Bernie Sanders was so successful among Latinos in many places. And I just think that, in fact, I know it sounds crazy, but in fact, over the past couple of years, it's the Republican Party that has done a better job of making inroads among Latinos, even not right in front of an election. So, for example, the RNC, the Republican National Committee, they opened up all of these RNC Hispanic community centers in places like Milwaukee. I think there are 4 of them in Texas alone that aren't only about voter registration. They're about food drives and pizza parties and back to school supplies drives to actually engage the community on all of the things that are important to the community. So they've established a real presence there. You know, it reminded me actually of studying Richard Nixon's 1960 campaign, where his advisor, Stuart Spencer, recommended starting like immigration clinics, job fairs in East LA as a way of building relationships with Mexican Americans in East Los Angeles. And so, you know, those are real investments, not just of money, but of time and energy and effort, and have shown Latinos that the Republican Party cares for them. This is what the theory is, that the Republican Party cares for them even when they're not looking for their votes. And I think that that's, whether you're Republican or Democrat, that is the way to go. I mean, to me, it seems like common sense. It doesn't seem all that surprising that if you want someone to vote for you, you first have to show them that you actually care about them. And I've heard many Republican Latinos express worry that if all of this momentum they feel they have, that the Republican Party feels that it has among Latinos, doesn't pan out tomorrow, they're worried that all of the investments that have been made over the past couple of years will be taken away, and it'll just be like politics as usual again. So it's not that Republicans have a lock on this. I think Republican Latinos are also worried that as soon as the election passes, the RNC will withdraw its support. So we'll see. But I think that is definitely the key to building relationships with Latinos.
Yeah, which, you know, I find really interesting. And I don't know if you saw Futuro Media recently conducted its first ever political poll that showed DeSantis as having like the highest favorable rating with Florida Latino voters. It also showed that in Florida, Republicans are rated more favorably than Democrats. And, you know, for us here at Tambora, the DeSantis favorability rating is quite surprising, especially in light of the governors transporting mainly, you know, Venezuelan migrants to Martha's Vineyard. And so do you find similarities between like, and I want to ask you about the Cuban exiles also, but do you see a similarity between Cuban exile politics and Venezuelan exile politics in terms of their adherence to like strong-arm politicians and draconian policies against members of their own community?
I do. I mean, it is true that, you know, Miami has been a kind of hub of Latin American right-wing activism for a long time. I mean, I'm just so struck going to like Caballero Woodlawn Cemetery and seeing Anastasio Somoza. He was the kind of leader of the Somocistas, the right-wing party in Nicaragua for many years, and the kind of opponent of the Sandinistas, a right-wing dictator. He's buried in Miami because he sought exile in Miami after his rule, you know? So there was a period when Cubans looked favorably upon the right-wing Nicaraguans who had fled to Miami in the 1970s and 1980s because they said, oh, you know, these guys are just like we were 15 years ago. They're fighting the same kinds of things. So then I think you can see this progression historically from like Cuban exiles fleeing left-wing regimes, Nicaraguan exiles fleeing left-wing regimes, Venezuelans fleeing left-wing regimes. And I think the kind of rhetoric about communism, socialism, and this idea that like, oh, we have embraced the Republican Party because we have seen the dangers of left-wing dictatorships in Latin America. There's really a through line there from group to group in Miami. So I think that's real. I have to say with DeSantis and others, I mean, I'm an expert, I guess, if you want to call me that. I've studied this for a long time, but there are things that I'm really surprised by that are happening right now. And I think, you know, DeSantis is not so much him personally, but some of the things that he and other Republicans get away with that seem to not make a dent in their support among Latinos. That's really interesting to me. And I don't really know how to explain it. I mean, I think to me, it's clear that the gambit of sending immigrants on buses to Martha's Vineyard it's pure political theater. You know, I mean, it's using immigrants as pawns for political gain. And, you know, yeah, you would think that would be received very poorly. But I think in general, we are kind of living through a really anti-immigrant moment right now in the United States. And, you know, not Eki's research. There was a New York Times Siena poll that came out in September of this year, and it found that some 37% of Latinos agree more with the Republican Party's policies when it comes to illegal immigration, compared with 46% of Latinos who think that the Democrats have the best policies on illegal immigration, quote unquote, illegal immigration. That's how the question was phrased to them. And that was surprising to me. I mean, 47 to 36, it suggests that yes, more Latinos still think that Democrats have better policies when it comes to illegal immigration, but 46 to 37 is the narrowest I've ever seen that in the 20 years or so that I've been studying this. I mean, usually it's more like 15%, 20% of Latinos who favor the same sort of restrictive immigration policies favored by Republicans. So that leads me to believe that things are changing, not just within our communities, but nationally, in terms of the real lack of empathy that we have with immigrants of any sort right now. And I have some theories about why that is. I mean, I think that, you know, the pandemic caused a lot of financial anxiety for a lot of people. A lot of Latinos were hard hit, lost their jobs, etc. I think also that we're just in very uncertain political times in the United States. I mean, we're talking about the collapse of democracy. And I think that these two things, a kind of public health crisis, a political crisis, combine to, you know, create a really uncertain atmosphere. And I think what I suspect is that in this context, it's really hard for many Americans, including Latinos, to have empathy for or show that they care about anyone else beyond their own family, their own local community. And I think that even though, you know, many Latinos, I think it's like 2/3 of Latinos either know someone who has immigrated to the United States illegally or has a family member who has. Is it illegally or just any form of immigration? I can't remember, but most Latinos are familiar with the issue of immigration. But even despite that, I think right now there's a kind of general lack of empathy for non-citizens in the United States.
Yeah, but that seems like the antithesis of who we are as a people, right? Yeah. Because at our core, we're about family, we're about community, and it seems, it seems very American to just only think about yourself and your immediate family, right?
Yeah.
In the Latino community, at least, I grew up in the Dominican Republic, right? I spent my formative years here, and now I'm back, and it's both. It's about, the well-being of your immediate family, but also your community. And so, it's scary to me. It's
It
scary.
is scary. It is scary.
Yeah.
But this is what I think. Like, I still haven't wrapped my head around everything that Trump means, but I do think that he shook something loose. He shook loose a lot of what we assumed to be true about a lot of things, not just in Latino communities, but about the workings of American politics generally. And so, I think DeSantis is kind of operating in that mold now. It's a kind of brashness. It used to be the case that Republicans thought that in order to court Latino voters, this was like the whole theory of why George W. Bush was so successful, that he was a kind of compassionate conservative. He supported comprehensive immigration reform. He worked with the Mexican president to get an immigration deal done before 9/11, and 9/11 shut all that down. That was a theory of the case. But I've talked to so many Latino conservatives in the past couple of years who've changed their tone on that, and they call George Bush Republican light, and they say that Donald Trump is a true ideological conservative. And what he has shown Latinos and all Americans is that you can have it both ways. You can stand for restrictive immigration policies at the same time that you win over Latino voters. And I can't say that they're wrong. I don't know, because you can see the changing opinions that Latinos express. So, the fancy term that political scientists give this phenomenon is kind of like permission structure. Like, what they think Donald Trump did is he gave permission for conservative Latinos who hold conservative views but have previously been reluctant to support conservatism in a full-throated way. He gave them the permission to do so. And now what you see is that idea running wild,
Yeah. Geraldo, I got to tell you that, I was hoping to have you on to boost my hope, but now I'm like biting my nails, like so nervous and anxious about tomorrow.
I am too, but look, here's I've actually today, one of the things I always try to check myself on is that I have been up to my neck in Latino conservative world for the past few years because of the research I do. So I feel like I'm so familiar with the conservative argument that I sometimes worry that I've become too comfortable with the conservative argument and need to pay more attention to the liberal democratic argument about things. And so in the past couple of days, I've read some really optimistic cases about tomorrow, that all of the polls are wrong. Republicans have been kind of flooding the zone with Republican polls to kind of change the predictions of these poll aggregators like 538, something like that. Okay. And that there's going to be a real groundswell of Democratic support because of the abortion decision. And there's already, a lot of early voting that has been done, and Democrats have a significant advantage in early voting. So maybe that portends good things. I don't know. But the worry there is that, Republicans, because they've been inundated with all of these messages about election security and voter fraud, that they're just not going to vote by mail and that they're all going to show up tomorrow. So we really just don't know. We don't know.
Okay. Well, thank you for helping to normalize my cortisol levels.
Yeah, sure. I'm trying myself to bring my own cortisol levels down.
So, I want to go back to the Cuban community for a minute because, most folks seem to think, and I will admit that I thought this to be true until I began, to do some digging and do some research about the Cuban community and Catholics, right? And how the Cuban community and Catholics were the main drivers of the increased Latinx support of Republicans, particularly in Florida, as we were talking about earlier. But your book says that, yes, that has something to do with it, but there's more nuance. There are many other factors that contribute to the Latinx Republican story, right? And it goes all the way back to, the time of, where in Dwight Eisenhower's presidential bid in 1952, Latinos con Eisenhower. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. It was interesting when a lot of the first interviews I did for my book were of conservative Mexican Americans who came into the party during the Nixon years in particular. And whenever I would talk about Cubans, they would be like, oh, the Cubans, they didn't even matter until 1980. And I was so confused because I was like, I'd heard, just like everyone else had heard, that the story of Latino conservatism is largely the story of the Cuban exile community. But a couple things to remember about Cubans is that they didn't really start to naturalize and therefore become eligible to participate in American elections until the 1970s. For much of the 1960s, after the Cuban Revolution, they were still kind of committed to Cuba and Cuban politics and ousting Castro so that they could go form a kind of government in exile. They were ready at the Bay of Pigs to take over the island. And so they were really committed to Cuban politics. In the mid-1970s, this is when there were all of these kind of naturalization drives, including at like Dolphins Stadium, where the Miami Dolphins play, the old stadium. And so that's when you really see Cuban Americans start to play a role in American politics. But when that happened in 1976 was the first time that there were a lot of Cubans to participate in the election, and they split the vote between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. I think Jimmy Carter in 76 actually won a slight majority of the Cuban American vote. So the point is that Cubans didn't get really involved until Reagan really brought them into the fold. Before that, because you had all of these Western political candidates like Barry Goldwater from Arizona, who had this whole kind of narrative of his life growing up along the Arizona-Mexico border. And he says that he spoke Spanish about as well as he spoke English as a kid. I don't think that's true, but this is the story he had of himself. Same thing with Richard Nixon, who tells a story about practically growing up alongside Mexican Americans in Southern California. These are the kind of Republican candidates who first tried to really bring Latinos into the Republican Party. Earlier than that, the Eisenhower episode you're referring to, that was not a kind of coordinated national movement by the Eisenhower campaign. Latinos in general were still a really small percentage of the American population. They were maybe 2, 3, or 4% of the American population in the 1950s. But there were a lot of Latinos who had served in the military during World War II. And for them, Eisenhower, the American general who helped win World War II, he was their guy, And so in the context of the Cold War, where, there was this rising threat of communism in Guatemala and Cuba and elsewhere, Puerto Rico too. I mean, I think a lot of the Puerto Rican independence activists were really seen at the time as communists and socialists. And at that time, Eisenhower presided over all of that stuff. And so there was some alignment of issues that drew Latino conservatives to Dwight Eisenhower. But I wouldn't call that a movement at that point. That's when you start to see some alliances being formed.
Okay. So Geraldo, we know that the Latin community is not a monolith, right?
Yeah.
However, I want to know if in your research you found any core hallmarks for, Hispanics, including, for example, the use of the label Hispanic versus Latino or Latinx who identify as Republicans.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So this is something that's interesting about the Reagan Hispanic campaign as well. And I can talk about both Republicans and Democrats here, but it's really Reagan's Hispanic campaign advisors. These people like Leonel Sosa, who was an advertising executive from San Antonio, a guy named Fernando Oaxaca, and another guy named Manuel Casillas. I think is it Manuel Casillas? I can't remember. Let's just stick with Oaxaca. And it's been a while. It's been a couple of years since I wrote the book now, so I'm trying to remember the names. But for sure, Leonel Sosa and Fernando Oaxaca, they were some of Reagan's campaign advisors, and they literally sat down in 1980, exchanged a lot of letters, had a lot of conversations about what it was that brought Latinos together. And that's when they identified things like their faith, their work ethic, their anti-communism. These were supposed to be the kind of big ideas that drew Latinos together. That's the Republican side of the story. You know, the Republican side of the story is that they still to this day, I think, don't do the same kind of work that Democrats do in micro-targeting specific communities. They don't have a particular appeal for Puerto Ricans in Central Florida compared with Cuban Americans in South Florida or Mexican Americans in Texas. What Republicans always try to do is just articulate these big themes like socialism, communism, faith, free enterprise, whatever. And they trust that those big ideas, those big conservative ideas, will draw in a lot of Latino supporters.
Yeah.
And what Democrats do, I mean, what they try to do is something similar, but for them, the issues that draw Latinos together are things like the common experience of discrimination that makes them more like people of color, like African Americans and other voters. So, for example, there's like this real debate within Latino scholarship and Latino politics about whether Latinos should be treated like an ethnic group or like a racial group. And the people who argue that Latinos are a race, they say that what brings Latinos together is the common experience of discrimination. I think things like, anti-imperialism can also bring Latino Democrats together, and other issues like that. I mean, so I think that, yes, there are things that bring Latinos together regardless of your political persuasion, but I think what those issues are can vary depending on what your politics are.
I see. Another nugget in Futura Media's poll is the finding regarding the Latino vote in Georgia. Specifically, as IZQ Strategies founder Gustavo Sanchez said, there is evidence that a combination, I want to make sure I get this right, that there is an evidence that a combination of racism and sexism among Latinos may be holding Stacey Abrams back since she is running against a white man. And so I bring this up because in your book, you mention, the ethnic competition, specifically as it relates to the Republican Party and the priorities of specific groups. But we know that, it also exists among liberals as well. And so my question, and I know that, my goodness, I'm going to hear about this from the community later, but I have to do it. I know that our community doesn't like to hang out our dirty in public.
Look, we got to have these conversations, man. We have to.
We have to have these conversations.
Yeah.
No. So how are you seeing the Latinx communities, like ethnic, class, and racial politics playing out on the national stage? And so I guess I have a part two to that question. What impact do you see it having in the immediate future and in the long term?
Wow. I mean, I do think you can see it in the immediate future, but I would really hope that in the long term, these are issues that we can sort out, have whatever difficult and open conversations we need to have about them to, purge them, but it's not just in Georgia that you're seeing it. I mean, I think we heard it on the tape from the LA City Council meeting a month ago. Yeah. And it's an issue that's playing out in the Los Angeles mayor's race, which is about a Black woman named Karen Bass running against Italian-American billionaire. I think he's Italian, named, Rick Caruso or something like that. This guy who's pumped hundreds of millions of dollars into his own campaign. He even stood on a debate stage and said that Latinos should like him because he's Italian, and so that makes him Latin, So I was talking to Gustavo Arellano about this from the LA Times a couple days ago, and as crazy as that sounds, I could totally see my grandma being like, "Oh yeah, he is Italian. That's right. That makes us."
Oh yeah, let's go Columbus, right? So
Christopher. Right. I know, and I've also heard that this Catholicism thing, he's a real Catholic, and they can draw some alliances there. So maybe there are some things that are in fact appealing about the Republican candidate for mayor of Los Angeles, this guy named Caruso. Gustavo Arellano was telling me that he even hears from Latinos the question, like, Caruso, that's a Latino name, right? Like, so they want to make him Latino. But, Karen Bass is a Black woman. And so, how do we know how much of the support Latinos have for Rick Caruso comes from the fact that they're drawn to him, or how much does it have to do with they don't want to vote for a Black woman? There was the most recent poll in the LA Times found that Caruso has a pretty sizable lead among Latinos over the Black woman Democrat Karen Bass, who's running for office. So I think you see it playing all over the place. I mean, I guess one point of evidence against this argument, one counter argument, I guess, would be the pretty extraordinary level of support that Barack Obama had among Latinos. I mean, in recent memory, I mean, he was the Democrat who did the best among Latinos in both 2008 and 2012. So, I think that was a real moment in 2008 and 2012 that we thought that a lot of what we had told ourselves in America about the promises of a multiracial democracy were kind of coming to fruition. We were seeing evidence of its truth and successes in the election of Barack Obama. And man, has that rug been swept from under us.
Tell me about it.
Amazing. And so, in the short term, I think that you can find some evidence that there's still is a case to be made about this. I mean, one thing I wonder is a place like Georgia, both of the Senate candidates, Democrat and Republican, are Black. So, they're both Black men. So, I mean, Latinos have to support one of them. And
right.
So I don't know if that is going to prove confirmation of like anti-Black bias or something.
Yeah, wondering if they'll show up in the same, the same number, right?
Yeah, maybe they won't show up. That's
maybe
right.
Maybe they won't show up. And I would have to, and I have to think that also, related to Barack Obama, he's a mixed man. Right?
Yeah.
Right. And as an Afro-Latina, I identify with that, right? Because I see multicultural in him, right? And I think that may have appealed to a lot of us because of that. And so, but it's an ongoing conversation that we all need to have as a community.
We do. I mean, I feel like I think we're long overdue for a really tough national conversation about Latinos and race, because I think on the one hand, this is again where I don't think like what happened after LA, what we started to do was just condemn anti-Blackness and talk about how it was Latinos buying into white supremacy.
That's right.
There might be some element of those things, but I don't think that those two observations alone get at the complexity of Latinos and race over a long period of time. And I think that to the extent that Latinos are a growing population in the United States, our population will continue to grow. We will continue to shape conversations about race identity in politics. I mean, I think we need to have like a fully open conversation about the complexity of everything it means to be Latino. And, I think part of this is just like an old history of the United States that has tended to see race through a black and white lens. But I think Afro-Latinas have often been left out of that conversation too. I mean, you read Nicole Hannah-Jones's book, 1619, great book, really important conversation starter, but doesn't have anything to say about the legacies of slavery in Latin America and Afro-Latino communities. So if you are an Afro-Latina or Afro-Latino, how do you see yourself included in that story about Blackness in the United States as well? You don't really, So I think, we need to have these conversations. I'm not.
Another project for you, perhaps?
Well, maybe. I mean, it's something I'm definitely writing a much bigger overview of Latino history right now, and it'll become part of that book. But man, I don't even know if I'm up to the task of having the whole conversation that needs to be had. I should say there are some amazing Afro-Latine scholars right now doing a lot of this work. I think that their position right now, justifiably, is more about the need to include Afro-Latinos into our story, both of Blackness in the United States and into stories of Latine history. I mean, I think that that's their position. And so they are really making forceful arguments about how long Afro-Latinos have been ignored, how we need to include them. And that's a really important critique of the field. But I think that there is going to be some moment too where we get beyond that critique and also have to assess, okay, we understand the critique, but what does the bigger picture look like now?
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. And Maria, our executive director, just said that our conversation after Uvalde spoke to that, and that's true. So I encourage our listeners to listen in.
Wait, I'll listen to that too. Can you tell me, Maria said that you guys had a conversation about...
So we had a conversation about colorism in Latin American community, and it's a series, it's an ongoing series that we're trying to have here at Tambora Dialogues, because it's very important in it, and it's affecting, and it's not just in Latin America, but also the Caribbean, right?
Yeah.
And in the U.S. too. So we're hoping to have some folks on to continue the dialogue as much as possible. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Awesome.
So I want to ask you, I know we're closing in on time, but I want to ask you a couple of additional questions. One specifically about the Latine youth, right? Are you familiar with Martin Wattenberg? He's a political scientist who mainly investigates like politics and presidential system and voting and public administration and the political economy. Yeah. And he wrote in one of his recent works entitled "Is Voting for Young People?" He talked about, what happened with Hillary Clinton's campaign, basically that in the general election, Clinton's problems with young people turned into her Achilles heel, because basically, the young people didn't come out to vote.
Yeah.
But in doing our research, at Tambora Dialogues, I did some digging and found that interestingly enough, the young people, particularly people of color, actually showed up to vote for Biden and Harris, right? Yeah. And so some papers, posited that the young vote actually helped Biden and Harris win the election. And so, my question to you is, are you seeing that, young Latine voters are following a similar political party trajectory as their parents, or is it too early to tell?
That's a good question. And when you say following a similar trajectory as their parents, do you mean in terms of party preference? Like, do kids of Democrats become Democrats? Because well, since I haven't studied this in particular, anything I say is kind of going to be anecdotal based on the few conversations that I have had. But I would say that, yes, they are by and large following the kind of partisan preferences of their parents. So one guy I interviewed a couple weeks ago is a guy named Abraham Enriquez, who's the founder of a conservative youth group called Bienvenido US. And he was telling me stories about kind of growing up, listening to his parents and uncles and tias and tios sit around the kitchen table talking about Ronald Reagan this, Ronald Reagan that. And he was trying to make the argument to me that Donald Trump is for his generation what Ronald Reagan was for his parents' generation, the kind of charismatic figure who drew Latinos, young Latinos too, into the Republican Party. And so, I do, it sounds to me, and I also see this on the other side from my students. I mean, I teach at a university in a Latina and Latino studies program, and they are by and large young progressive Latinos who are very politically involved. And so I think that Latino youth are politically involved for sure. They're engaged. They have a lot at stake in the future of American politics because they're going to be living with this world much longer than you or I will. So they have a lot at stake. It's not clear to me. I mean, I think by and large, they will continue to skew progressive or are so far, but it has been really interesting to me. And there was a finding in an ECIS research report too that came out in, I can't remember if it was late September or early October, which found that one of the groups of Latinos who over the past 4 years have been most likely to be disaffected by the Republican Party or disillusioned by the Republican Party is youth. So they did this survey of like 16,000 Latinos, and there was an overrepresentation of young Latinos in their survey who reported voting for Biden in 2016, but now disapproving of the job he's done as president and are open to considering other possibilities. And likewise, there's a guy named Mark Hugo Lopez, who's the kind of data person at the Pew Research Center, and he sent me a bunch of survey results that he found that the Pew Center did, which found that young Latinos ages 18 to 35 are no more or less likely to be conservative or liberal than other age cohorts like 35 to 50, 50 to 65. So there was no noticeable difference in the partisan preferences of young Latinos and older Latinos, which I think cuts against a lot of what we tend to think, which is, we place so much of our hopes and expectations on the youth. They're the ones who are going to save us, right? But I don't know. It's a weird moment we're living in at ASMA.
Yeah. I mean, I remain hopeful of our youth. I have 2 young boys, and I'm raising them. My husband and I are raising them to be, liberated youth, right? To make decisions for themselves. So my hope is that some of this generation would also have, be free thinkers and be able to make decisions that are healthy for them, beneficial for them, but also for generations to come. So I guess we'll know more tomorrow and in the coming years. Yeah. So my last question as we draw to a close is, what do you feel the midterm results will tell us about, the priorities of GOP, let's say Latino Hispanics?
Well, I feel like for the past couple of years, we've really been talking a lot about, the coming red wave or hope for a blue wave. And to me, we're just like oscillating between these two extremes. Like it's either going to be a red wave or a blue wave. And I don't expect either of those things to happen. I think that the results are going to be, they're going to point in different directions. I think the picture will be a lot murkier. I think that Republicans will win some races with Latino support, and Democrats will win some races with Latino support. And to me, the thing I'm interested in seeing is what kind of post-election spin and narrative making by Democrats and Republicans those mixed results allow, because I think that it's going to be possible for both Democrats and Republicans. I mean, there will, I'm not saying nothing will get settled. I mean, control of the Senate, control of the House, those issues will get settled. But what role Latinos will have played in that, I think will be open to some interpretation. And I think I would expect to see both things happen. I would expect Republicans to say, like, let's take a look at South Texas. I think even if Republicans lose in South Texas, I think if Mayra Flores and Monica de la Cruz lose, but do even better than Donald Trump did in those areas, I think they will say things like, these Republican Latinas did better even than Donald Trump in South Texas. That proves our point that Latinos are becoming more conservative. Just wait till the next election, wait till 2026. I think in the places where Republicans win with Latino support, they will say things like, look, this has proved our theory of the case that Latinos are in fact becoming more conservative. On the other hand, if in the places where Democrats win with Latino support, I think they will say, like, look, we knew all along that 2020 was an anomaly because of the pandemic, because of Donald Trump. And we knew that once we started reinvesting in Latino communities, that Latinos would come home to the Democratic Party. So I think that both of those narratives will be possible with mixed results after tomorrow night. And that, of course, just means that we are, kicking the can down the road a little bit more to figure out what's really going on among Latinos. And I have to say that I don't think that, if you want a little hope, I don't think some enduring confusion and curiosity about what's up with Latinos and some recognition that there are no really easy answers when it comes to Latinos. I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing for Latinos, because it leads to a kind of greater complexity of understanding about us. And I think that that isn't only a bad thing.
Yeah, and allocation of resources to
Right.
further engaging, right? Which can only be positive for our community.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. So Gerardo, thank you so much for joining our drum circle today and for your insight. I am sure that we will reach out again after the midterm.
Yeah, I'll be around.
Just debrief.
Yeah, I won't have any fingernails left or hair, but
that's me too. That's me
I'll
too.
be here. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care.
To all of you watching or listening, I leave you with a quote from Kamala Harris, our vice president, where she says, "The freedom to vote is the freedom that unlocks all others." So please remember to vote tomorrow, mi gente. Hasta pronto.